behind you.
That's right. That's right.
We are almost. Okay. Good morning, folks. It's nice to have you in Lakeside, Chautauqua for our conclusion of our Faith for Living week with the Reverend Dr. Shively T. Smith, Assistant Professor of New Testament at Boston University School of Theology. We've really benefited this week from her teaching and her inspirational words on Howard Thurman and the images that she's brought to us, and then sharing those with the deep biblical resources and also resources for today. We have the fourth image that's coming up this morning, and I can hardly wait to see what it's going to be. But before that, I would like to remind you that this evening we have Vespers. If you are here at Lakeside, Vespers at the Steele Memorial Bandstand at 7:30 with the Reverend Karen Graham leading on the fruits of the Spirit. Here, that will be her sermon topic. And then at following communion service, and we'll have some live music following that for a sing-along. That'll be a great time together this evening. And then this coming Sunday, we welcome the Reverend Dr. Myron McCoy, senior pastor of the Chicago Temple in downtown Chicago, who will be with us Sunday and all next week, and he will be with us live. Dr. McCoy is the former president of St. Paul Theological Seminary, and we welcome him for a week with us here at Lakeside. It is our custom on the last day to offer a prayer of blessing for our guest speaker. And I'd like to share that this summer, we've hosted now four theologians, four women theologians who are having a tremendous influence on the life of pastors in the next generation and also lay people. And we are thankful that all of them have taken their time from their schedule to share with us and to be with us. First of all, we welcome Caroline Lewis from the north, from Minneapolis. And then we welcomed Lisa Wolf from the west, from Oklahoma City. And then we welcomed Anna Carter Florence from the south, from Atlanta, Georgia. And this week we're honored to have Reverend Shively T. Smith from the east, from Boston, Massachusetts. And so these four women are influencing the next generation of pastors and leaders in our churches, and we are thankful to have them with us. If the church is in their hands, and it is in good hands, and we are so happy to have each of them with us. So would you join me now for a moment of prayer? Dear God, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for the beauty of your creation. And we give you thanks for this time that we can spend reflecting upon the things of the Spirit. We give you thanks for the life of Howard Thurman, for his influence and his continuing influence in our day. And we thank you for Dr. Shively Smith, who is lifting up his work and adding to it work of her own that is inspiring the next generation of pastors and lay people in our churches across the country. We ask your richest blessing upon Dr. Smith as she faces a fall and an uncertain time in the life of our country and in the life of our theological institutions, and indeed in the life of higher education in general. We pray your special blessing upon her ministry, upon her husband and her two daughters, and upon all those whom her life touches. We thank you for her giving of herself. We thank you for her answering your call and for being willing to share out of the depths of her heart with students and with us. We ask that you would continue to bless her and keep her in your care. Hold her close to you, Lord, and help her always to do what is pleasing in your sight. All this we pray in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, Dr. Smith, welcome. And it's good to have you. Good to have you with us this morning.
Thank you so much. It's such a blessing to be here again, and I can hardly believe this is the last day of this week. We have had a wonderful journey. I have had such a wonderful time sharing with you and just the community near and far, and so just look forward to future engagement. I am going to take a moment and share my screen as you are used to me doing now. All right. So, good morning. This is our fourth and last day of our time together for the Faithful Living Hour. And I really do want to thank everyone for your presence and your support this week. It has, as I said before, been a joy and a delight to share with you each morning out of the spaces in which I am doing my work and feeling called to engage. And really just am thankful for the journey together. I do hope this has been a time of refreshing and renewal, reflection and inspiration, and a welcomed exercise in Christian imagination and centering for you this week. As we considered what it means to have an intentional and potent relationship and relatedness to God, to neighbor, and to self that can produce new frames of reference for us. We have looked at Howard Thurman, we have listened to Howard Thurman, we have looked and listened to the biblical text. We have hopefully looked inside our inner selves and thought about and paid attention to and became aware of those images that are right there in our mind's eye that we may not have realized are shaping how we interpret and understand our faith and live out our faith personally, but also in community with others. This form of metaphorical interpretive play, as I like to call it, can provide new ways for thinking about what kindness, compassion, relatedness looks like for our neighbors and for strangers, to those communities and stories we are familiar with, and those communities and stories we are still learning to listen to and embrace and bring close. As I have done in these past few days, I want to do now, which is to invite you to get comfortable. Grab a journal or a piece of paper to reflect on for a few minutes. Grab a piece of canvas or something to color with if you're someone who paints or who doodles as you reflect. Perhaps you're someone who just likes to sit and drink a cup of coffee and listen and meditate, or to look out on the horizon. This is your moment to get comfortable. So I invite you to get comfortable now. All week, starting with the sermon on Sunday, I have used versions of Howard Thurman's invitation to sit quietly and see oneself pass by as as the centering moment. I want to end our time together this year by reading and reflecting on the meditation that includes that line. So this meditation is actually called How Good to Center Down. How good it is to center down. We will still lift up an image for this meditation to create space for us to visualize and reflect through images and through exploring the presence of these images, the use of these images in the biblical text. And then I'll leave you with a special gift at the end of our time together. So a little bit more time for reflection, for you to sort of listen to and watch and take in as you reflect, not just on the image for the day, but the images that we have engaged all week. So hear these words, my sisters and brothers and siblings, from Howard Thurman's Meditations of the Heart, his meditation called How Good It Is to Center Down. How good it is to center down, to sit quietly and see oneself pass by. The streets of our minds seethe with endless traffic. Our spirits resound with clashings, with noisy silences. While something deep within hungers and thirsts for the still moment and the resting lull. With full intensity we seek ere the quiet passes. a fresh sense of order in our living, a direction, a strong, sure purpose that will structure our confusions and bring meaning in our chaos. We look at ourselves in this waiting moment, the kinds of people we are. The questions persist. What are we doing with our lives? What are the motives that order our days? What is the end of our doings? Where are we trying to go? Where do we put the emphasis? And where are our values focused? For what end do we make our sacrifices? Where is my treasure and what do I love most in life? What do I hate most in life? And to what am I true? Over and over, the questions beat in upon the waiting moment as we listen, floating up through all the jangling echoes of our turbulence. There is a sound of another kind, a deeper note, which only the stillness of the heart makes clear. It moves directly to the core of our being. Our questions are answered, our spirits refreshed, and we move back into the traffic of our daily round with the peace of the eternal in our step. Oh, how good it is to center down. Oh, how good it is to center down. And I want to center down today by paying attention to and pondering this imagery of streets that Thurman gives us. Thurman uses the metaphor of street to talk about the traffic of our minds and the need to create space that allows us to listen to ourselves, our world, our neighbors. Hear these opening lines again. How good it is to center down, to sit quietly and see oneself pass by. The streets of our minds seethe with endless traffic. Our spirits resound with clashings. The streets of our minds. Thurman uses the language of streets to invite us to create new space for the inner work of the self, for reflection about where we're going, what we're doing, why are we doing it. Streets become the sort of pathway or journey for him, the invitation for us to take the journey of querying ourselves about our directions, our hopes, our work in the world. It is the way in which Thurman seeks to create space to discern where we are, what we are doing, where we are going, who is going with us, why do we do what we do. He contextualizes the streets of our minds as not just places of activity and certainty, but places of inquiry and questions, places of wonder. The streets of our inner selves can be places of great distress where we are unsettled, or our inner streets can be places of great encounter, great possibility, great hope and refreshing and inspiration. The imagery of streets is yet another way Thurman invites us to activate our Christian imaginations and to imagine what is possible in relatedness to God, to self, and to each other. As I have done these days, I do now, which is to invite you to visualize the streets of your mind, to visualize and to sit quietly and capture what are the streets that you are seeing in your mind's eye. As my question states, what do you visualize when you ponder the image of street and the streets of your mind? What do you visualize? What do the streets look like to you? Where are the streets? Where do they go and where do they stop? Who do you encounter on the way? And who do you never, ever see in the streets of your mind? Why are those bodies and stories not on your street? Are the streets that you imagine busy, or are they quiet? Are they spaces of people going here and there, to and fro? Are they spaces of leisure? Are there many people on your streets, or is it practically empty? Is your street a highway, a path, a journey into the woods, or is it a journey into the city? How does your street or the streets that you imagine help you think about what it means to relate to God, to relate to neighbor, to relate to self? What do you visualize when you ponder the image of street? As I've done before, I have some images that I would like to provide to continue the reflection process. Perhaps when you think about streets, you imagine the morning traffic cycles. Thurman initially alluded to the streets of our mind being like traffic. All the cars and people are out at once. For some of us, during this season of social distancing and quarantine, that seems like a very long, like an event that occurred, that was a cycle that happened a long time ago, right? But yet, when you think about streets, you can't help but think about that morning traffic that you used to, or maybe are still involved getting in day to day. Perhaps when you imagine the streets of your inner self, you imagine the streets that look like neighborhoods, or your neighborhood. It's full of driveways, entrances and exits. There are flower beds, there are children, there are people, there are bicycles. You see people laughing, people coming and going, people on the cycles, or what Thurman would talk about, involved in the daily rounds of their life. Perhaps the streets of your inner self that you imagine are a little bit closer to home, a little bit closer to what it means to be family, to be neighbor, to be community. Perhaps when you think about streets, you think about the open road with all of its possibilities and the many destinations you might go. When you think about streets, you think about what it looks like to launch into the unknown and to see whatever it is to see as you're just going along for the ride. Perhaps you're a history person like myself, and you're thinking about those excavated marble streets of Ephesus that provide us access to some of the visual aesthetics and architecture and function of streets in the biblical world, especially from the perspective of the biblical text. Perhaps when you think about streets, you actually want to do a little bit of going back in time and imagining the streets of Jesus, the streets of Paul, the streets of Peter and Mary, the streets of Joseph, the streets of Sarah. Perhaps you want to imagine the streets of those Hall of Famer faith figures from Hebrews 11 that you love to think about and ponder. What did their streets look like? What did their paths look like? Perhaps when you think about streets, you think about the options we have before us, the many different streets and directions that we can be presented with at once to go see God's world, to go into all the world and make disciples and friends and colleagues and new family. in the world. Perhaps when you think about streets, you think about the mountains and the valleys, the clear days and the foggy days, the sunny days and the days of rain. When you think about streets, you think about all that which you encounter in nature and among the people of the world. Perhaps when you think about streets, you think about the crossroads of the unexpected. You think about how we can cross paths with people, places, and things we had not noticed before. The crossroads of life where you find yourself wondering, are you now a part of my journey? And am I now a part of yours? Should there be more to this moment than just a chance encounter? Should we take the streets together? Perhaps when you think about streets, you think about the crossroads of the unexpected, but you also think about those opportunities to link up with others and to stand in solidarity, to make not just one voice be heard, but many voices be heard all over your neighborhood, all over your city, all over your state, all over the nation, all over the world. When you think about the streets, you think about the power of communities and bodies from all over, people with different languages and cultures and histories standing in the streets together, declaring we are all human beings. We are all made in the image of God. We are all made for dignity and flourishing and opportunity and access. That is what God calls good. Or perhaps we should think about streets in terms of the signs we encounter. We think about the streets in terms of the signs that tell us to stop and to go one way or to go another way. The detours of life that we have to take, the dead ends that we come upon unexpectedly, and then we have to backtrack and try a different way. We think about those places in which we must use caution, in which we must pause, in which we must yield to others who are crossing our path to continue on their way. We think about those U-turns that we make. We think about all the times in which we stop, go, pause, caution, look here and there and everywhere. We consider our movements and the movements of others. Perhaps when you think about streets, think about the street signs that we encounter as we journey. Perhaps when you visualize and think about streets, you think symbolically about the choices of life. The choice to stay the path in the direction you are going, or to reverse course and go another way. When you think about streets, you may think about the signs of life. You think about the questions you ask and the questions you need to muster the courage to ask. Because God is big enough to hold all of our questions. When you think about the street, maybe you think about the aesthetics and the creativity that can occur there. You think about the beauty street artists can bring to the roads. You think about the images we see when I lift up mine eyes and I am reminded of what real courage, what real heroes and sheroes look like and do, not for their own gain, but for the protection and the provision and the voice and the dignity and the life and flourishing of others. Perhaps when you think about streets, you think about what it means to lift up your eyes and be reminded of what it means to care about not just God and self, but to care about neighbors, to care about others, to care about the lives that are before you, the lives that you know, the lives that you don't know. Here's my question again. What do you visualize when you ponder the image of street? When you ponder the image or the images of the streets of our minds. So street in the Bible is very much present. And so I want to do a little bit of that work, as I always do, to talk about street in the Bible. Street in the Bible, as a term, as an occurrence, has a very urban sort of flavor, a very urban city-like feel to it, as opposed to language of path or way or road, which is a bit more broad and general in the biblical text. But when we talk about street, a lot of times in the biblical text, we are talking about proximity to cities. We are talking about proximity to places where there are masses of people that gather, that live in close quarters together in real ways. Oftentimes, the events that take place in the streets of the Bible are events that feature large crowds of people and convey the difficult realities of city life in the ancient world for the majority of people. As one scholar says, to be in the street or the city square is to be instantly accessible, visually and audibly, to the masses. It is the location for three things. When we talk about streets, we're talking about the space for public meetings. We're talking about the space for public ministries or services. And we're talking about the place for public occasions of honor. Places of public meetings, places of public ministries and services, places of public occasions of honor. And I would actually add to that and say places of public shame. Streets as a setting in the Bible reflect what is going on in the city as a whole. As a setting or place in our biblical accounts, streets are the windows into what is taking place in the larger urban space and communities the streets are located within. To talk about what is occurring in the streets or the state of the situation in the street is also code for talking about the overall well-being, situation, spirit, attitudes, moods, and activities of the city and the people in the city, broadly speaking. Both good and harsh things are depicted as happening in the streets, which means good and harsh things are happening to the people of the city as a whole. You see this juxtaposition quite vividly in the prophetic literature. So, for example, we have street scenes of suffering in Lamentations chapter 2, verse 19. Arise, cry out in the night, at the beginning of the watches. Pour out your heart like water before the presence of the Lord. Lift your hands to God for the lives of your children who faint for hunger at the head of every street. Street imagery in the biblical text also will find with street scenes of joy, prosperity, and flourishing in the prophetic literature. So when you look at some place like Zechariah 8:4, you get this. Thus says the Lord of hosts, old men and old women shall again sit in the streets of Jerusalem, each with staff in hand because of their great age. And the streets of the city shall be full of boys and girls playing in its streets. Street searches occur where you look to identify the character and possibilities of the city based on the individuals one can find in a street according to the biblical accounts. Think about Jeremiah 5:1. Run to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem, look around and take note. Search its squares and see if you can find one person who acts justly and seeks truth, so that I may pardon Jerusalem. So again, streets are a place of accessing the attitudes and the values and the commitments of not just the individual, but the city as a whole, to capture the spirit. Remember, we talked about at the beginning of the week, capturing the spirit and the wind of our faith. In some ways, the streets are the place where you can capture the spirit and the wind of the city. You can take the pulse of the people and what is most important to them, according to the biblical text. Here's another one from Song of Songs, chapter 3, verse 2. I will rise now and go about the city, in the streets and in the squares. I will seek him or her whom my soul loves. I sought him, but found him not. So the streets are the place in which we are seeking for people that we want to bring close, according to the biblical text. Streets in the Bible are also the setting in biblical text, are often places where you may encounter what's the quote unquote undesirables of that society designates. One scholar states it this way: streets in the Bible are a place of shame and disrepute. This setting in the Bible presents soiled and tainted, or this playing on the purity codes, these impure images. Homes are depicted as wholesome environments, while streets and the people and things that are in them are not. So there's this juxtaposition of the home environment and the street environment that plays out in the biblical text. Is very important to pay attention to. For example, in Lamentations chapter 4, verse 5, we get this quote: those who feasted on delicacies perish in the streets. Those who were brought up in purple cling to ash heaps. This juxtaposition of the home setting versus the street setting. This is a world, it's important. I keep playing with this language of honor and shame. This is a world in which shame and honor and shame is not just about reputation, but it has to do with access to opportunities, resources, communities. It has to do with access to and a sense of place, a belonging that's at work in the biblical text. When honor and shame fundamentally has to do with issues of survival and quality of life. You see this in the controversial chapter in Proverbs 7, in which Lady Wisdom is juxtaposed to the street prostitute. It's not just one woman is good and the other is bad. The social matrix is quite complex here in Proverbs. One woman is depicted as embraced and homebound, and the other is depicted as having to live a life outside home, forsaken, abandoned. I mean, what you really get is this sort of, and a real suspicion that is cast on this body because the body is associated with the streets. We often miss the social implications of the situation of the Proverbs 7 streetwalker woman and what that says about a city that has space for safety and stability for some demographics, but only suspicion, right, and danger embedded in on other bodies. Here's this Proverbs 7. I picked a few verses for you to see this juxtaposition at play. Proverbs 7, verses 4 through 8, and then I pick up verse 12. Say to wisdom, you are my sister. Call understanding friend. So she might guard you against the mysterious woman, from the foreign woman who flatters you. When from the window of my house, from behind the screen, I gazed down, I looked among the naive young men and noticed among the youth one who had no sense. He was crossing the street at her corner and walked down the path to her house. She has one foot in the street, one foot in the public square. She lies in wait at every corner. Again, I've sort of, I did a little bit of picking some of the verses there, but it really is, again, this juxtaposition of Lady Wisdom, who is associated within the house and as one to be embraced, and then the woman who is on the street. The gospel story provides a critique on this and the movement from home to street. Whereas this proverb seeks to warn the young people or young men not to move from home base to street, to actually avoid the street and street life. The good news of Jesus makes a different declaration about the relationship between home base and street base. A prime example of this is the parable of the banquet guest in Luke 14, verses 15 through 24. Here, Jesus Banquet parable is powerful for the ways in which it reverses the movement on display in Proverbs 7. The wisdom and potency of transformation of social norms of the kingdom of God triggers a reversal. Instead of warning seekers of God's wisdom and spirit about going out into the streets and engaging what is there, the good news advocates for seekers of God's wisdom and God's spirit and the work of God to bring the streets into the home spaces of God's people, into the home spaces of God's life-sustaining, life-giving, life-affirming, life-celebrating provision. Hear these words from the parable. I will quote them at length. Luke 14, 15 through 24. When one of the dinner guests heard Jesus' remarks, he said to Jesus, "Happy are those who will feast in God's kingdom." Jesus replied, a certain man hosted a large dinner and invited many people. When it was time for the dinner to begin, he sent his servant to tell the invited guests, "Come, the dinner is now ready." One by one, they all began to make excuses. The first one told him, "I bought a farm and must go and see to it. Please excuse me." Another said, "I bought 5 teams of oxen and I'm going to check on them. Please excuse me." Another said, "I just got married, so I can't come." When he returned, the servant reported these excuses to his master. The master of the house became angry and said to his servant, "Go quickly to the city streets, the busy ones, and the side streets, and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, the lame, those who are outcast and ignored." The servant said, "Master, your instructions have been followed, and there is still room." The master said to the servant, "Go to the highways and back alleys and urge people to come in so that my house will be filled. I tell you, not one of those who were invited will taste my dinner." A little harsh, but yet powerful. What does it mean to open up the spaces of our homes to the streets? What does it mean to see the streets as a place that we are not to avoid, but they are to be engaged? That in the streets is where we will find our friends, is where we will find those who we will journey with and reason together about the things of God. That in the streets, when we bring them in and when we go to them and we find relationship, this parable, this good news is in those encounters is where you will find deep relatedness to God, deep relatedness to yourself, deep relatedness to your neighbor. When I think about the imagery of streets that Thurman proposes to us, and the imagery of streets in the biblical text, I am inspired to remember just how transformative the work and the relatedness of God and God's Spirit is. The ways in which it not only changes the streets and homes, but it changes us. The ways in which those who we are not accustomed to feeling familiar with or accountable to or responsible for, the Spirit of God, the relatedness of God, when we think about the streets of our minds, the streets of our hearts, the streets that are around us in the world, we realize that there are vast opportunities to encounter God in new and fresh ways. The centering moment is a moment to encounter the streets that we are familiar with, the streets that we are unfamiliar with. It is to encounter the self that we know and to encounter the self that we don't know. It is to think about the people that we would naturally, without thought, invite into our home spaces, and to think about the people we have yet to extend an invitation to. What do you visualize when you think about streets and you think about the streets of your mind? Let me reread this Howard Thurman meditation to you one more time. how good it is to center down. How good it is to center down, to sit quietly and see oneself pass by. The streets of our minds seethe with endless traffic. Our spirits resound with clashings, with noisy silences, while something deep within hungers and thirsts for the still, still moment and the resting lull. With full intensity, we seek ere the quiet passes, a fresh sense of order in our living, a direction, a strong, sure purpose that will structure our confusion and bring meaning in our chaos. We look at ourselves in this waiting moment, the kinds of people we are. The questions persist. What are we doing with our lives? What are the motives that order our days? What is the end of our doings? Where are we trying to go? Where do we put the emphasis and where are our values focused? For what end do we make sacrifices? Where is my treasure and what do I love most in life? What do I hate most in life? And to what or to whom am I true? Over and over, the questions beat in upon the waiting moment. As we listen, floating up through all the jangling echoes of our turbulence, there is a sound of another kind, a deeper note, which only the stillness of the heart makes clear. It moves directly to the core of our being. Our questions are answered, our spirits refreshed, and we move back into the traffic of our daily round with the peace of the eternal in our step. How good it is to center down. What do you visualize when you ponder Thurman's imagery of streets and you ponder streets in the biblical text? I want to share one moment with you and create a final space of centering for you in this. This is my hope for you this day and as you go forward in 2020. Give me 1 second. I want to bless you and gift you with this last song, this song about streets by Esperanza Spalding called On the Sunny Side of the Street. I hope that no matter where you go or what you do in this world, that you will seek the kinds to do the kinds of work and to have the kind of presence of streets and relatedness to yourself, to God, and to neighbor that brings sun and light and spirit and hope that sees the eyes of the people and the things that you encounter. I want to leave you with this song very quickly for just a couple of minutes for you to think about the power of the sunny side of the street.
I used to walk in the shade with my blues on parade. But I'm not afraid, it's over, passing right over. Grab your head and grab your coat, leave your worries on the doorstep. Just direct your feet to the sunny side of the street. Can't you hear the pitter-pat and that happy tune in your step? Life could be so sweet on the sunny side of the street. I used to walk, I admit, in the shade with my blues on parade. But I'm not afraid, pocket filler, stardust at my feet. Oh, the sunny side of the street. Oh, baby.
So it's my hope that you have been gifted with, have found a gift in these, in this time together. I want to end with one last slide if I can get to it. Hold on one second. So one of the things I've really been gifted by the emails and the different correspondences that I've received. And one of the questions I've received just ending is some of the resources that I've used this week to engage you through this process of reflection, what I call visual interpretive reflection. And so here are some of the texts that I've used from the Howard Thurman Meditations of the Heart. There's another book called Deep is the Hunger by Howard Thurman that is also a book of meditations as well. They don't have the titles that you're used to in Meditations of the Heart, but that is yet another text of meditations that are available from Howard Thurman. Also, Jesus and the Disinherited is the book that I was referencing as a text that folks like Martin Luther King would journey with. And a new text that's coming out featuring scholars and practitioners and people who have journeyed with Thurman in their own work and lives is anchored in the current. That text is in the process of coming out. Full disclosure, I contributed to that text as well, but that's another space. If you want to continue to be introduced to Thurman through Thurman's work, but also through the work of those who journey and continue to reference him, both for their work in the spirit, but in their hands, head, and heart as well. And then last is, if you're interested in some of this biblical imagery that I was pulling from in the biblical text, two resources that are available, reference resources that are available to you, the Dictionary of Biblical Imagery and the dictionary, two different resources of dictionaries of biblical imagery are places where you can see some of the images of the biblical text that you may not have paid attention to, or to hear the range of meanings and significance of these images in the biblical text. Again, I just want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to spend this week with you in reflection about the Bible, about Thurman. It has been my delight and my joy, and I wish all of you many, many blessings as we all together continue to work on our inner selves and to do the work of radical, loving, compassionate, kind, and courageous relating to God, relating to neighbor, relating to self as we center down. God bless.
Thank you, and God bless you too, Dr. Smith. Thank you so much for sharing with us the rich resources of Howard Thurman and your own biblical scholarship, which helps us so much. I want to say thank you to Sue Cox and to the Bud Cox Endowment for supporting this week. Bud Cox was the former executive director here at Lakeside, much beloved, and his wife Sue and their family has continued his legacy with an endowment, which we appreciate so much, that has brought Dr. Smith to us virtually this past week. And I also want to say to folks that are watching that you can submit questions via the platform that you're using. And there is a bit of a delay, so please do that now if you have questions or comments so that we can get them in before the hour is over. And I would just like to, I wanted to just share, and I wish that we could be together with more discussion. So I would just kind of share on behalf of the group. On the lakefront, Dr. Smith, is a path. Lakeside was founded in the 1800s when there were no cars. And so the streets are very narrow. There's porches and a lot of interaction on the sides of the streets, but the lakefront path is not open to cars. And it is just simply a walking path. And it's called the Ohio's Most Beautiful Mile because there's flowers all the way down, and it's just beautiful. And people decorate their cottages with beautiful flowers and Victorian symbolic things. And as I was thinking about the streets, that street immediately came to mind. You don't know who you're going to meet on the street. They're almost always friendly people, and just a beautiful image. And I contrasted that with the street that the church where I help out during the rest of the year is in downtown Cleveland, and the atmosphere is very different. Buses, cars, and so-called street people who are having many problems, and situation our church tries to minister with them, but so much different street there. And also the idea of, we had a service at the church I served, a worship service called GPS, to kind of get people on track. And if you get off track, they say recalculating. We try to get people back on the track. Another image of street. So this just brought a host of images in my own mind, and a lot to think about. And I thank you for that on behalf of the Lakeside constituency. So maybe you want to share more something else about streets from your own perspective. You live on a busy street, or?
Yeah, no, I don't. I live in a sort of a neighborhood quiet area in some ways, but a lot of my work is sort of in the world of the busy streets in a real way. I mean, one of the reasons why I picked this piece for me was the fact that it's very easy to read Thurman and to sometimes, particularly when you do the meditations and you're doing this sort of personal inner work, because he's very attentive to the inner life, to get very individualistic and very personal, so that when you hear him talking about quieting the streets of our minds from the traffic, it becomes almost very abstract and internal work, just working on yourself, and it sort of feeds into sort of our hyper individualism. But if you really read deeply and broadly Thurman, you realize that the work of the inner self is not disconnected from the work of yourself to others, right? And so that when he's talking even about the inner streets, that work of inner self is not a way to escape the work of being in streets, but I would talk about in proximity to people. But that work is necessary, because that is what should strengthen us to create even deeper relatedness and proximity to people in a real way. And so that for me is what sort of led me to start looking at the biblical text language of streets, and to recognize this broad range of street imagery and references that are going on, and what becomes the God talk around the imagery of street in the biblical text. So what I gave you in terms of juxtaposing the Proverbs 7 to Luke 14 is really the place where I find so very profound this notion that if we are doing the inner work that Thurman is talking about, then it becomes easier and even a necessary move for us to do, to open the banquet halls of community, the banquet halls of access, of hospitality, of affirmation up to bodies that we know, but even more importantly, to bodies and communities that we don't know. And that becomes the real challenge of the gospel message. It's not that it's good news because it's easy. It's good news because it's radical, it's transformative, it changes how we relate to each other in a real way. And that is in many ways what Thurman is trying to do when he uses language of streets and traffic and roads to talk about the journey of deep relatedness that changes our proximity and accountability and responsibility to each other.
Thank you so much. And it's so easy, I think, when you're on a journey to get on the wrong street or get off the track, and I think part of the reason for Lakeside and part of what you're saying is, we need to continually check the map and make sure we're on the right street
Absolutely.
and going the right direction.
And then we're journeying with people. I mean, so the other piece in
Yes.
the gospel stories that you get is you end up getting a lot of street language when Jesus says he sent the 70 out 2 by 2, go into the streets and that is a partnering endeavor. Right. And as an academic,
Right.
I have to remind myself, because sometimes academics, I'm very, very comfortable with my books and my writing and being in my office. But part of the journey is also about developing relationships where you go the way together. Right.
Yes.
And what good news is that even in our individual callings and vocation, part of that calling, no matter how you cut it, requires you to be in partnership with other people. So we go into the world together. So I like to ask, how are we building partnerships and relationships with people as we're going into the streets, as we're going on the way?
Yeah, that's well said. When I was a district superintendent, I had a lay person say that his pastor could get up and preach a beautiful sermon about love and then turn and walk to his office and not speak to anybody. And that was a problem, because it was, the consistency and getting from point A to point B, which again is part of the street imagery of walking together and working with each other. And you brought that out in a beautiful way.
It is the journey. It is the journey. It is the path of us seeking to always remember that we can never outrun God. We can never outrun God's spirit. We're always sort of playing catch up. And that journey requires us to do it in relationship, in proximity, with great intentionality, or in the Thurman language that I've been trying to sort of leverage all week, with great centering of self in that process.
Thank you. Why do you think Thurman has such an enduring influence, Dr. Smith?
I think Thurman has an enduring influence because he's able to articulate in such vivid imagery that it is not time bound, the fullness of what it means to live as human beings. So he captures the joys, he captures it's almost like the births and the deaths, the marriages and the dynamics, what it means to live life dynamically, and that he articulates it in a way that allows us to be reflective, allows us to be inspired, allows us to be convicted, right? Allows us to recognize that there is always more that we can and should be doing. And he articulates it with great hope. I think there's something to that. There's something to being able to be people who speak from deep wells of heart and truth, with the intention of bringing life to not just your own person, own community, own families, but to generations. I mean, so at the end of his autobiography, Head and Heart, Thurman's last 2 sentences of that biography, he brings what he means about head and heart together and says, I take my stand with the generations before me ahead. So he's doing everything he can to connect so that other generations can have life and have connectivity and have relationship. And
the head and heart is also a John Wesley concept. So he's continuing that legacy as well.
Absolutely.
So, very much.
And you see that language show up in other people, such as sort of in the 19th century African-American woman, Anna Julia Cooper, who uses the same language of head, heart, and hand. So this is very rich language for our Christian faith and what it means to live our faith out in society in really powerful and profound and transformative ways.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Smith. I want to say that we have a group of at-risk youth that we work with at Lakeside, and the slogan for that is TNT, till next time. And I want to say to Dr. Smith, till next time, we fully intend to have you come back to Lakeside, although it will be kind of coming for the first time, but we just really look forward to having you with us in person, and that is our goal, and we really look forward to that. And Dr. Smith has been too modest to say it, but she has her own book, Strangers to Family, basically focusing on First Peter, and that is available through our fine print bookstore here at Lakeside. They will help you order that book, and that will give you further insight into some of the other work that Dr. Smith is doing. She works on the whole New Testament, but especially on these books. We want to thank you, Dr. Smith, for being with us. Again, Dr. Shively T. Smith, the Assistant Professor of New Testament at Boston University School of Theology, which I modestly said on Sunday is the finest theological institution in the world.
Right.
And we thank you for your presentation. We want you to come back, and with God's blessing, we will say TNT till next time.
Till next
Dr.
time.
Shively, God bless you.
God bless you and everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.